Hi guys, let's talk about the water cycle. The water cycle is basically how water moves through Earth's surface and even underneath the ground, right? And through the atmosphere. Here's some vocabulary that you should know, right? Evaporation is when water turns from a liquid to a gas. Condensation happens in the clouds, right? When it turns from a gas to a liquid. Precipitation is when it falls as rain, snow, sleet, or hail. You should know what the ocean is, right? The largest body of water on Earth. And the sun is actually what powers the entire water cycle, right? The water cycle would not happen if it wasn't for the sun starting, not really starting the process, right? But getting the process going with evaporation. Here's a picture that I need you to label. Here's the same picture in color, okay? So we have evaporation, right? And then it goes up into the clouds, condenses, and becomes liquid again, precipitates down, right? There's runoff where it's going over the ground. And then we have the ocean, down here, right? 75% of Earth's surface is the ocean. I want you to notice the trees right here are also releasing water vapor, so it's in the form of a gas. So trees can release water also and be part of the water cycle, and this is called transpiration. This is a picture from your textbook that I need you to cut out, right? And so we have here 97% of all the total water mass is oceans, and then of the fresh water we have glaciers and groundwater, and then lakes, streams, wetlands, and atmosphere. Where do we get our water? The Rio Grande, right? So it's going to be here in about this about 1% area. Here's a view, kind of like a cutout so you can see underground, because I wanted to talk about aquifers, which is groundwater, right? So we have surface water on the surface and we have groundwater underground. And we can drill wells to get to that water underground, and pump it out to drink it or use it to, water crops and things like that. Here's another view of groundwater, right? It's not like an empty bubble of water, right? We have rocks and sand and dirt mixed up in an aquifer, but you can see here the aquifer underground right here, and you can see the lake. So this is groundwater and surface water. And the water table is where the top of the water is, right? If you're standing here on the land and you start to dig down, you will eventually reach the water table, right? Or the saturated zone. This is unsaturated zone, this is saturated zone. And so the water table is where the level of water is, and you'll notice that it connects here to this surface water. Here are the major aquifers in Texas, right? So this is our groundwater here. We have the Edwards Aquifer here, which encompasses the area of San Antonio. They have really strict water restrictions in San Antonio because of the Edwards Aquifer. There's actually an endangered salamander that lives there called the Texas blind salamander, and it is protected. So they have to be really careful to not take away its habitat in this aquifer. A recharge zone or a watershed is how a body of water gets more water, right? So think about your phone, right? When your phone is running out of battery, you plug it in to recharge it, right? You refill it with energy. Well, the recharge zone of a body of water like the Rio Grande or Maverick County Lake, the recharge zone is what anything that rains in that area is going to eventually end up in that body of water, right? So we call that the watershed also. So this is the watershed for the Rio Grande, right? Pretend that this is the Rio Grande, this is the United States, and over here is Piedras. And so anything that rains here will eventually end up in the Rio Grande, right? And you can see the water table right here. If I'm standing here and I start to dig down, right, I'll eventually reach the water table, which connects with where the river is at, okay? So this is called the watershed or recharge zone. Here are all the river basins or watersheds for Texas. So you'll notice this dark brown one or kind of maroon colored one, number 23, is the recharge zone or the watershed for the Rio Grande. All of this, any rain droplet that falls in this area is going to end up in the Rio Grande and then eventually the Gulf of Mexico. And so you have different ones around here, like this kind of mustard colored one is the Red River, right? The Red River serves as the boundary between Texas and Oklahoma, and so it recharges this area. Here's the whole United States, right? And you'll notice that the Rio Grande watershed also goes all the way up into New Mexico and Colorado. And And so any rain droplet that falls here, right, will end up in the Rio Grande. And so you even have, like, look at the Mississippi, right? We have the upper Mississippi and the lower Mississippi. So the Mississippi River goes through here, and any rain droplet that falls in these areas, right, ends up in the Mississippi River. And then we also have the Continental Divide, right, which is around this area over here. So any water droplet that falls in this area actually ends up in the Atlantic Ocean. Any water droplet that falls in this area ends up in the Pacific Ocean. So let's compare surface water and groundwater, okay? Surface water is on the surface, right? Lakes, oceans, rivers, and ponds, and groundwater is underground. So that's aquifers. Now these can change, right? Surface water can become groundwater through what's called percolation or seeping through. And then in a spring, right, groundwater becomes surface water. It literally looks like the ground is leaking water, and it can be a really big leak. It can create a whole river or a lake. But basically groundwater is coming up out of the ground and making like a lake or a river, okay? And that's called a spring. Let's talk about how much water exists, okay? I kind of gave you some hints about this already. So here we're going to use 1,000 milliliters of water to represent all of the water on Earth, okay? This is like those giant graduated cylinders that we used during the measurement lab. That's 1,000 milliliters. So imagine one of those, right, full of water. That's going to be all the water that exists on Earth. So I want you to go ahead and write a prediction as to how much of this out of the 1,000 is salt water and fresh water. If the total, right, that we have on Earth is 1,000 milliliters, then your two numbers here should add up to 1,000. So go ahead and write down how much of the 1,000 do you think is salt water and how much do you think is fresh water? Okay, here is your answer. 972 milliliters would be salt water, a lot, right? And only 28 milliliters of that would be fresh water. So let's break down the fresh water. Here's what we have for fresh water. Of those 28, 23.5 is going to be frozen in glaciers and ice caps. 4 of those is going to be groundwater, so in aquifers. And then of all of that, the lakes and rivers is only 2 drops and 1 drop for soil and air. That's very little, right? So were you surprised at any of the amounts? Write down yes or no. Do you feel the need to conserve water? Okay, think about it. Maybe you'll think twice about whether or not you should turn off the faucet when you're brushing your teeth next time. I hope. What do the bottles represent? The bottles represent Earth, right? All of the water on Earth. Does the amount of water in Earth ever change? No, right? The water that we have has been going round and round the water cycle forever. So the water that you drink at the water fountain today could be water that a dinosaur drank millions of years ago, right? And then peed it out. Okay, really quickly, I wanted to go over the layers of the atmosphere just because this is where the water cycle happens, right? So we're going to start from the farthest away from Earth and come down towards the surface of Earth. So the outer layer of the atmosphere, right, is called the exosphere, right? It's the very outer edge of the layer before, right, the thermosphere. And so this is basically kind of what is extending into outer space. Then underneath that, right, we have the thermosphere, right? And it's actually getting hotter and hotter as you get out further away from Earth, right? We have the mesosphere, is the middle layer of Earth's atmosphere. This is where meteoroids burn up. So whenever you see a shooting star, right, that's a meteor coming through the atmosphere. This is where it's catching on fire. Then a little bit closer to us, right, the layer of Earth's atmosphere that contains the ozone layer that actually protects us from a lot of the sun's UV rays is the stratosphere. And then the one that's closest to us, the one where we walk around in it, right, where there's weather, that is called the troposphere. Okay, so that's it for the water cycle. If you have any questions, please let me know, and thank you for watching.